Hey guys, this is Eric Tarr for theproaudiofiles.com. I wanted to put together some ideas for you about creative ways of using reverb inside of your mix. In this video, I'm going to be focusing on convolution reverb and how you can process it so that it fits well with your song. Now, when most people think about convolution reverb, they think about loading up a static impulse response. But if that impulse response doesn't fit with your song, you load up a different impulse response. And you go through this process one after another until you find an impulse that actually fits sort of well with your track. What I want to show you how to do is how you can tailor and tweak the sound of that impulse so it actually fits really well with your song. And when you do this, you take a static impulse response and you actually make it very, very flexible. To begin with, let me show you some tricks I like to use with reverb on drums. I'll play my drums first without reverb. Alright, so that's a boring, dry drum mix. I want to make it more exciting by adding reverb to my snare. So what I've done is taken my snare top, snare bottom microphones, bust them over here to an auxiliary track I called snare verb. Then I inserted up here the Waves IRL plugin that can convolve an impulse response. Then I loaded up an impulse response from the Stone Room recording studio. Now I'm just going to blend in the sound of that reverb and actually overemphasize it so you can really hear what's going on. Alright, now let me get to actually processing the sound of this reverb. One common technique and popular technique that people will use with reverb is actually to use an equalizer to change the spectral shape of that reverb. So I'm going to show you just how to do that. You can do things like brighten it up or darken it by shaping the high frequencies. Maybe roll off the lows. A/B it. Alright, so that's a very straightforward, common way of processing reverb so that it fits well with your song. Maybe you need to roll off the lows or boost the highs so that it fits in with other instruments in your song. Now there are some limitations to this kind of processing, what you can and cannot do. For instance, as an example, on a lot of algorithmic reverbs, you have separate controls for changing the reverb length of your high frequencies separate from your low frequencies. So on a lexicon reverb, this is one of the common controls, reverb time for the highs versus the lows. Now, if you just use a spectral processor and equalizer like this, you don't have the ability to really do that. All you can do is brighten it up or darken it. So what I want to show you how to do is how to use a different kind of processor to have this kind of control that you would normally only have on an algorithmic reverb. I'm going to use here the Waves C6 multiband processor, because not only can you do spectral processing with it, but because you have control over doing things like upwards expansion and downwards compression, or you can use it as a dynamic equalizer, you can actually change the length of the high frequencies separate from the low frequencies in your reverb. So let me show you how you can do this. Brighten it up, darken it. Right, so it's a great equalizer. And another thing that you can do here is set this crossover frequency right here. So I'm primarily going to be focusing on the high mids and the low mids. The other bands are, I swept them all the way to the ends of the spectrum. So what I'm going to show you how to do is first, to begin with, on my upper mids or my high frequencies, use upwards expansion to actually change the length and elongate the tail for the high frequencies separate from the low frequencies. So what I'm going to do is bring down the threshold into the range where the reverb is, and then bring up this range so that I am actually doing upwards expansion on the tail for the high frequencies. And change the release time to really make it long. Shorten it back down. Again, you have separate control of the gain. So you make sure it's not too dark, but still change the length of the highs. You can do the same thing with the lows. Maybe do the opposite. I'll do downwards compression, so that this is going to shorten up the length of my low frequencies. Still boost them up so it's not too bright. Hopefully what you're able to see now with using this kind of multiband processor, you have so many more degrees of freedom. Not only do you just have spectral processing to make things brighter or darker, but now you can actually accomplish what you could only do before with an algorithmic reverb, which is to change the length of the high frequency tail separate from the low frequencies. So now you can really dial in a sound that fits with your track. If you want to get really crazy, what you could do is duplicate this track here for reverb. Now I have one separate that I'm going to use just for my lows. So if I go in on this plugin, solo the low frequencies right here. Go in on the other one next to it, solo the high frequency band. Now I have the same kind of control that I had before, plus extra gain control here, but then I can add in all kinds of other plugins after the fact, like modulation kinds of effects that you'd find on algorithmic reverbs, and just add that modulation to the high frequencies. So all kinds of other control by opening it up and doing multiband processing on your reverb. Next, let me move on to some tricks I like to use with reverb on vocals. Alright, now let me show you some tricks that you can use to change the perception of the stereo field of your convolution reverb. Here I'm going to be adding reverb to my lead vocals. I'll start out by playing my vocals in context with the mix and then bring in the reverb, again overemphasizing it so you can really hear it.
We messed around, but as empty as we were, there was no love to be found.
So just like before, I took the signal I was interested in and busted over to a separate auxiliary track, this time called Vocal Verb. I inserted my reverb plugin, the Waves IRL, and loaded an impulse response. This time the impulse comes from the Bricasti M7. Now I'm going to process it so I can change the perception of the stereo field. Pull up a plugin like the Waves S1 Imager. Now what I can do is actually widen out the reverb, or I can also make it narrower. So depending on my mix, whether I've got a lot of other instruments that are filling out the stereo field, maybe panned hard left and hard right, I can make the reverb narrower so they don't get in the way of the other instruments, or the opposite's the case. Maybe I actually want to use my reverb to fill out the stereo field. So just by processing it like this, making it wider or narrower, I can accomplish this. I'll even solo these so you can really hear it by itself.
We messed around,
More of a mono reverb.
but as empty as we were, there was no love to be found.
Or extra wide.
So I take the pills to help me sleep.
So this is one way that you can fit your reverb in with all the other instruments in your track. And you can even change it depending on what part of the song is. Maybe during the verse, you want to make a narrow reverb, make it wider through the chorus. Another way to go about doing this would be to use a different plugin. Here's the Waves Center plugin. It actually performs mid-side processing. In this case, what I'm going to do is carve out the center so I only have the signal on the sides, or I can carve out the sides and only have the signal in the center. It sounds like this.
We messed around, but as empty as we were, there was no love to be found. So I take the pills to help me sleep.
So this is another way that you can actually change the perception of width, such that during certain parts of your song, you make it more of a mono reverb, or during other parts of your song, you make it really wide and make it more of a stereo reverb. Again, if you want to get crazy with this, what you can do is come in here on your vocal reverb, you can duplicate it, devote one of these just to be the center, so pull out the sides, go over here to your other one, pull out the center. Now you have a mid-side matrix for your reverb.
We messed around, but as empty as we were, there was no love to be found.
Now you can do things like process these independently by adding other plugins in there. So again, you could add modulation kinds of effects. You could also add in this kind of dynamics processing that I showed you in the previous part of the video, where you do upwards expansion or downwards compression to change the length of your convolution reverb either on the sides or in the center. So hopefully I gave you guys a bunch of new ideas for how to use convolution reverb and make it very flexible that you can apply it to your track and really dial in the settings that fit well with your song. Again, don't just feel like you can use these techniques on vocals and drums. Apply them all over the place and really see what fits for you. I'd love to get your guys' comments and feedback on this. I'll be checking them below. Until next time, take care, guys.